Hello, and welcome to Europe After Midnight. Picture two infants, twin boys, floating in a reed basket down a flooding river. They have been left there to die, cast out by order of a king who fears them. The basket snags on the roots of a fig tree at the river's edge, and there, in the mud and the rushes, a she-wolf finds them. She does not devour them. She feeds them the way she would feed her own cubs, while a woodpecker stands watch overhead. This is how the story of the most powerful empire the ancient world would ever know begins. Not with an army, not with a fortune, with two abandoned babies and a wild animal's strange, inexplicable mercy. How does a city born from such a desperate beginning come to rule the known world? That is the question we will spend our time together untangling tonight. Tonight we travel back nearly 3,000 years to the 7 hills beside the Tiber River, where a small collection of shepherds' huts will grow into Rome. We will follow the legend of Romulus and Remus and the founding of the city. We will watch as Rome casts off its kings and builds a republic, a government designed to prevent any one man from ever ruling alone again. We will walk beside Julius Caesar as he crosses a small, fateful river called the Rubicon, and we will stand in the Senate on the day the daggers come out. We will witness the golden peace of the Roman Empire at its height, when a single law and a single language stretched from the sands of Britain to the deserts of Syria. And we will trace the long, slow, and often quiet unraveling that brought it all to an end. This is the story of Rome, a story of ambition, genius, betrayal, and the enduring question of how anything so vast could ever fall. But before we begin, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to a time of marble and dust, of she-wolves and senators, when 7 small hills stood empty beside a quiet river, waiting for a city to rise upon them. The story the Romans told about their own beginning was never meant to be tidy history. It was meant to explain something deeper, why a people who started with nothing came to believe they were destined for everything. According to the legend, the twins Romulus and Remus were grandsons of a deposed king, thrown into the Tiber by a jealous usurper who feared a prophecy that they would one day take back the throne. The river, swollen with floodwater, carried them gently instead of drowning them, setting their basket down at the base of the Palatine Hill. The she-wolf who found and suckled them became, for the Romans, the single most sacred image of their own origin, a symbol still cast in bronze and displayed in the city today. A shepherd named Faustulus discovered the boys some time later and raised them as his own, never telling them the truth of their birth until they were grown men. When the brothers finally learned who they were, they resolved to found a city of their own on the very hills where they had washed ashore as infants. But a new question split them apart almost immediately. Which hill should the city stand upon? Romulus favoured the Palatine, Remus favoured the Aventine, a neighbouring rise just to the south. Neither brother would yield, and so, as the story goes, they agreed to let the gods decide. Each twin would watch the sky for a sign, and the one who saw the greater number of birds would have his hill. Remus saw 6 vultures first, but Romulus, watching from the Palatine, later claimed to have seen 12. The dispute over whether speed or number should determine the winner curdled quickly into fury, and in the chaos that followed, Remus was killed. Roman writers themselves were never entirely comfortable with how this happened. Some claimed Romulus struck the blow himself in rage. Others said one of his followers did it. Livy, writing centuries later, could only shrug and say that this was simply what was passed down. What remained consistent and what the Romans never tried to soften was the outcome. Their city was founded on a brother's blood. The founding myth begins not with harmony, but with violence between kin. The Romans seem to accept that shadow as fitting for their city. Theirs, after all, would be a people who spent the next 1,000 years locked in cycles of ambition and betrayal. With Remus gone, Romulus became Rome's first king. Tradition dates this founding to the year 753 BC, and it is from this date that the Romans themselves would count their history for the rest of their civilization. But a city needs more than a founder. It needs people, and Romulus faced an immediate and very practical problem. His new settlement, filled largely with shepherds, runaway slaves, and exiles from other towns, had almost no women. Without wives, there would be no second generation, and the city would die with its first. Romulus tried diplomacy first, sending envoys to the neighbouring tribes to request marriage alliances. He was refused, and refused with contempt. The neighbouring peoples saw Rome as a rabble of criminals and outcasts, unworthy of their daughters. So Romulus turned to a darker solution. He announced a great festival in honour of the god Neptune and invited the surrounding tribes, including the Sabines, to attend. The Sabine families came in good faith, bringing their wives and daughters to watch the games. At a prearranged signal, the Roman men seized the young Sabine women and carried them off, while their fathers and brothers fled in terror or were driven away by force. History remembers this as the rape of the Sabine women. It is one of the most uncomfortable episodes in Rome's own account of itself. The Romans did not hide from it. They told it plainly, as the price their city had paid to survive its first years. War followed, as it had to. The Sabine king Titus Tatius raised an army and marched on Rome to reclaim his people's daughters. But according to legend, the war ended not with a final slaughter, but with an extraordinary act of intervention. The Sabine women themselves, now married into Roman households and bound to both sides by blood and by children, ran into the space between the two armies. They begged their fathers and their husbands to stop killing each other, arguing that whichever side won, they themselves would lose either a father or a husband. The armies stood down. Rather than destroying one another, the two peoples merged into a single city, with Romulus and Titus Tatius ruling jointly until the Sabine king's death left Romulus as sole king once more. It is a strange story for a civilization to tell about itself. It begins in kidnapping and ends in reconciliation. Even in its first years, Rome seemed to understand that its greatness would be built on violence and on the uneasy peace that follows it. Romulus is said to have ruled for nearly 4 decades before vanishing from the world in a manner as mysterious as his birth. During a military review on the Campus Martius, a sudden and violent storm swept over the assembled army, and when the clouds cleared, the king was gone. Some Romans whispered that the senators, growing resentful of his increasingly autocratic rule, had murdered him in secret and torn his body apart to hide the evidence. But the official story, the one carved into the city's memory, was gentler and far more useful to a people building a national identity. Romulus, they said, had been taken up into the heavens, transformed into a god, and would watch over Rome forever after under the name Quirinus. After Romulus, tradition holds that 6 more kings ruled Rome across roughly 2.5 centuries, each adding something essential to the raw, unformed city on the Tiber. Numa Pompilius, a peace-loving Sabine chosen to succeed the warrior Romulus, is credited with establishing Rome's earliest religious institutions, its priesthoods, its sacred calendar, and the eternal flame tended by the priestesses who would become known as the Vestal Virgins. Tullus Hostilius, by contrast, was a king remembered for his aggression, expanding Roman territory through war with the neighbouring city of Alba Longa. Later kings, some of Etruscan origin, brought engineering knowledge from the more sophisticated civilization to Rome's north. It was under Etruscan influence that Rome first learned to drain its marshy valleys, to build in stone rather than mud brick, and to construct the Cloaca Maxima, a great sewer that would keep the city's low ground dry for centuries to come, some sections of it still functioning beneath the streets of Rome today. But it was the seventh and final king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, known to history simply as Tarquin the Proud, who would bring the age of kings to its end. Tarquin had seized the throne through violence, arranging the murder of his own predecessor, and he ruled afterward not through the consent of the Roman people, but through open intimidation. He surrounded himself with an armed bodyguard, executed senators he distrusted without trial, and ignored the ancient customs that had, in theory, bound even the kings of Rome to consult with the city's council of elders. The Roman people endured him for years, but endurance is not the same as loyalty, and beneath the surface of the city, resentment was gathering like water behind a dam. It would take one final, personal act of cruelty, committed not by Tarquin himself but by his own son, to break that dam entirely and to end forever the rule of kings in Rome. What that act was, and what the Romans built from its wreckage, is where our story turns next. The son's name was Sextus Tarquinius, and the woman he wronged was named Lucretia, the wife of a Roman nobleman named Collatinus. According to the account passed down by Roman historians, Sextus was received as a guest in Lucretia's home, and in the night he came to her chamber and assaulted her, threatening that if she resisted he would kill her and leave a dead slave beside her body, staining her name forever with the accusation of adultery with someone beneath her station. Lucretia submitted to save her family's honour, but she had no intention of living with the shame of it. The next morning she summoned her husband and her father, told them plainly what had happened, and demanded they avenge her. Then, before either man could stop her, she drew a hidden dagger and drove it into her own heart. Her death became the spark. A nobleman named Lucius Junius Brutus, who had been present when Lucretia died, pulled the bloody dagger from her body and swore a public oath over it, vowing to drive the Tarquin family from Rome forever, and to ensure that no king would ever rule the city again. Brutus carried Lucretia's body into the Roman Forum, and as word spread through the streets, the fury of the people did the rest. Tarquin the Proud, away with the army at the time, returned to find the city gates barred against him. He and his family fled into exile, and the monarchy that had ruled Rome for 2.5 centuries ended, according to tradition, in the year 509 BC. But driving out a tyrant was only half the task. The Romans now faced a harder question. What kind of government could replace a king without simply inviting a new one to take his place? Their answer was a system carefully balanced against the concentration of power. It would go on to shape political thought for the next 2,500 years. Instead of a single monarch, the Romans elected 2 consuls each year, magistrates who shared supreme authority and who could each veto the other's actions. A term of only 12 months meant no consul could entrench himself in power the way a king might. And standing beside this new office was an older institution, the Senate, a council of aristocratic elders who advised, guided, and in practice dominated Roman policy through the sheer accumulated weight of their experience and family connections. This was the Republic, res publica, the public thing. A government built on the conviction that authority belonged to the state and never again to one man alone. Yet the Republic Brutus helped create was not, in its early decades, a government of the whole people. It was a government of the patricians, the old aristocratic families who held the Senate seats, controlled the priesthoods, and monopolized the consulship. Beneath them stood the plebeians, the ordinary citizens, farmers, craftsmen, and soldiers who made up the overwhelming majority of Rome's population and who bore the heaviest burden whenever the city went to war. For generations, plebeians could not marry into patrician families, could not hold most public offices, and had little formal say in how the laws that governed their lives were written or enforced. This created a deep and persistent tension at the very heart of the young republic. How long would a people who fought and died for Rome's survival accept being shut out of Rome's government? The plebeians found their answer not through petition, but through withdrawal. In 494 BC, facing crushing debt and what they saw as unjust treatment by patrician creditors, the plebeians simply walked out of the city. They marched to a nearby hill and refused to return, effectively going on strike from the entire apparatus of the Roman state, leaving the patricians to till their own fields, fight their own wars, and staff their own workshops. It worked. Rome without its plebeian majority could not function, and the patricians were forced to negotiate. The result was a new office, the tribune of the plebs, a magistrate elected solely by the common people and granted an extraordinary power, the ability to veto any action taken by a consul or the Senate that harmed plebeian interests. A tribune's person was declared sacred and inviolable, protected by law from arrest or physical harm while in office. The solution was imperfect. The struggle between patrician and plebeian, known to historians as the conflict of the orders, would continue for nearly 2 more centuries. But it established something that would define Rome for the whole of its existence, a belief that the Republic's laws could be reshaped through pressure, however slowly, rather than only through violence. While Rome slowly worked out the terms of its own internal government, it was also fighting, constantly and often desperately, simply to survive. The early Republic was surrounded by hostile neighbours, the Etruscans to the north, various hill tribes to the east, and other Latin cities competing for the same fertile land along the Tiber. Roman territory in these first centuries amounted to little more than a modest patch of central Italy, and there was nothing inevitable about its survival, let alone its eventual dominance. Rome expanded the way it would continue to expand for the next several hundred years, one hard-fought war at a time, absorbing defeated neighbours sometimes as conquered subjects and sometimes, remarkably, as new citizens. This willingness to extend Roman citizenship to former enemies, unusual among ancient states, would prove to be one of the Republic's greatest long-term strengths, turning conquered peoples into invested stakeholders rather than permanently resentful subjects. By the early 3rd century BC, Rome had fought its way to control of the entire Italian peninsula. It now stood, for the first time, as a major regional power. And a major regional power, it turned out, could not avoid the notice of Carthage, a wealthy trading city on the coast of North Africa that controlled much of the Western Mediterranean's commerce and dominated the seas with a navy Rome could not yet match. The two powers eyed each other across the narrow straits of Sicily with growing suspicion, and in 264 BC, a dispute over a Sicilian city ignited the First Punic War, the first of 3 brutal conflicts between Rome and Carthage that would consume the better part of a century. Rome had almost no navy at the war's outset, and its early efforts at sea were disastrous. But the Romans displayed a trait that would define their success again and again throughout their history, a relentless, almost stubborn capacity to adapt. According to tradition, when a Carthaginian warship washed ashore largely intact, Roman engineers took it apart, studied its construction, and used it as a template to build a fleet of their own in a matter of months. They then added an innovation of their own devising, a hinged boarding bridge fitted with a heavy iron spike, nicknamed the corvus, or the crow, which could be dropped onto an enemy ship's deck and locked in place, turning a naval battle into something closer to the land combat Roman soldiers already excelled at. The solution was crude, but it worked. After more than 20 years of grinding warfare, Carthage was forced to sue for peace. It ceded Sicily and paid a massive war indemnity to Rome. The peace did not last, and it was not meant to. A young Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca had grown up hearing his father speak of Rome with undying hatred, and as a boy he is said to have sworn an oath before the gods that he would never be a friend to the Roman people. War broke out again in 218 BC. This time Hannibal chose a route into Italy that no Roman had thought to guard. He marched his army, war elephants included, directly over the Alps. The crossing was brutal. Cold, hunger, and hostile mountain tribes killed a significant portion of his men and animals before he ever reached Roman soil. What followed was one of the most catastrophic military campaigns in Rome's history. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, Hannibal's forces surrounded and annihilated a Roman army of unprecedented size. By some ancient estimates, as many as 50,000 Roman soldiers died in a single day. The loss was so staggering that black cloth was said to hang in the doorways of the city for weeks afterward, and yet Rome did not surrender. This, perhaps more than any single victory, was the quality that separated Rome from the states it would eventually eclipse. Another city might have negotiated for peace after Cannae. Rome did not. The Senate refused even to discuss ransoming the survivors. New legions were raised again and again. It was as if the population could regenerate its will to fight faster than its enemies could destroy it. The war dragged on for over a decade, fought not only in Italy but in Spain and North Africa, until a Roman general named Scipio, having studied Hannibal's own tactics with obsessive care, carried the war directly to Carthage itself. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, Scipio finally defeated Hannibal on African soil, forcing Carthage into a humiliating peace that stripped it of its navy, its overseas territories, and its power to make war without Rome's permission. A third and final war, decades later, would end with Carthage burned to the ground and its surviving population sold into slavery. Rome now stood alone as master of the Mediterranean, but the wealth flooding into the city was about to strain a government built for a small republic, not an empire. Victory, it turned out, was more dangerous to Rome than defeat had ever been. The wars against Carthage and the conquests that followed in Greece, Spain, and North Africa poured a staggering volume of new wealth into the city, gold and silver in tribute, vast estates seized as spoils of war, and hundreds of thousands of enslaved people captured in every campaign. But this wealth did not spread evenly through Roman society. It concentrated, almost entirely, in the hands of the senatorial class, the same old aristocratic families who had always dominated the Republic's government. Wealthy senators bought up huge tracts of conquered land and worked them not with the free farmers who had once tilled Italy's soil, but with cheap enslaved labour brought home by the legions. These vast estates were called latifundia, and their rise had a devastating human cost. The small farmers who had once made up the backbone of Rome's citizen army found themselves unable to compete, their modest plots swallowed up, or their livelihoods undercut by slave-worked estates that could produce food far more cheaply than they ever could. Many were driven off their land entirely and drifted into Rome itself, swelling the city into an overcrowded, restless, and increasingly desperate urban poor. This was the world into which a young nobleman named Tiberius Gracchus was born, and what he saw troubled him deeply. As a young man travelling through the Italian countryside, he was struck by the sight of vast estates worked entirely by chained foreign slaves, with barely a free citizen farmer to be seen for miles. He is said to have remarked that even the wild beasts of Italy had dens and lairs to retreat to, while the men who fought and died for their country possessed nothing but the air and the light, wandering with their wives and children and having no place to lay their heads. Tiberius was elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BC. He proposed a law to address this directly, limit the amount of public land any one family could hold, and redistribute the surplus to landless citizens. It was, by later standards, a fairly modest reform. To the Senate, whose members stood to lose enormous personal fortunes, it was an existential threat. What followed broke a boundary that Roman politics had, for nearly 4 centuries, managed never to cross. Tiberius then sought re-election as tribune, defying a tradition that office holders should step aside after a single term. A mob of senators and their supporters, armed with clubs and broken furniture, cornered him in the forum. They beat him to death, along with hundreds of his followers. It was the first time in the history of the Republic that domestic political conflict had ended in mass killing on the streets of Rome itself. A decade later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius, taking up the same cause of land reform and expanding it further to include cheap grain for the urban poor, met a strikingly similar fate, killed along with thousands of his supporters when the Senate authorized the consul to use whatever force was necessary to restore order. The bodies of the Gracchi brothers, according to tradition, were denied proper burial and thrown into the Tiber. Rome had discovered that its own laws contained no mechanism to stop a political dispute from ending in bloodshed, and having discovered it once, the temptation to reach for violence again would prove impossible to resist. The door the Gracchi had forced open was walked through, a generation later, by 2 men whose rivalry would very nearly end the Republic outright. Gaius Marius was a self-made general from outside Rome's traditional aristocracy, a soldier's soldier who reformed the Roman army in ways that would echo for centuries. Before Marius, legionaries had been property-owning citizens who supplied their own equipment and fought, in theory, out of civic duty. Marius opened the ranks to Rome's vast population of landless poor, arming them at state expense and, crucially, promising them land and a pension upon retirement. It made Rome's armies larger and more effective than ever before, but it also fundamentally altered where a soldier's loyalty lay. A legionary no longer looked to the Senate or the abstract idea of Rome to secure his future. He looked to his general, the man who had personally promised him land and reward. Rome's soldiers were slowly, almost invisibly, becoming the private instruments of ambitious commanders rather than the shared property of the state. Marius's great rival was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, an aristocratic officer who had served under him before their relationship curdled into bitter enmity. The Senate handed Sulla command of a lucrative war against a king in Asia Minor. Marius maneuvered to have the command transferred to himself instead. Sulla's response shattered whatever remained of the Republic's unwritten rules. Rather than accept the insult, he marched his own legions, Roman soldiers, on Rome itself, becoming the first man in the city's history to lead an army against the capital he had sworn to serve. He captured the city, forced through the political changes he wanted, and then departed to fight his war in the east. But the precedent could not be unmatched. Marius and his allies seized power in Sulla's absence and carried out a bloody purge of their political enemies. Sulla finally returned to Italy years later. He marched on Rome a second time. This time his revenge was systematic and terrifying. He introduced a practice called proscription, public lists naming men declared enemies of the state. Their property could be seized by anyone. Their lives could be taken by anyone too, with a reward paid to the killer. Thousands died. Sulla then had himself declared dictator, an emergency office that Roman law had always intended to be temporary and strictly limited, and used its powers to remake the Roman constitution before, in a move that stunned his contemporaries, voluntarily retiring from public life altogether. Sulla's retirement did not restore the old republic. It only proved, to every ambitious man watching, that the Senate's authority could be overridden by anyone willing to bring an army to the gates of Rome and was prepared to use it. The old norms, the unwritten agreements that had allowed patrician and plebeian, consul and tribune to share power without resorting to civil war, had been tested and found breakable. A new generation of Roman politicians grew up in the shadow of this lesson, watching as raw military force proved more decisive than any office, any law, or any tradition the Republic could offer. Among the young men who absorbed this lesson most completely was a talented, ambitious, and deeply indebted aristocrat in his 20s, a nephew by marriage to Marius himself, who had narrowly escaped Sulla's proscriptions, and who was, even then, quietly building the political relationships and reputation that would one day make him the most consequential man Rome had ever produced. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar, and the story of what he would do with the broken republic he inherited is where we turn next. Julius Caesar did not begin his career as a soldier, though it is as a soldier that history remembers him best. He began it as a young man drowning in debt, financing a lavish public image he could not yet afford, certain that Rome's political system, chaotic and violent as it had become, was also an opportunity for a man clever enough to exploit it. He borrowed staggering sums to fund extravagant public games, understanding, correctly, that the Roman public's affection was a form of currency all its own. Pirates once captured him while he was crossing the Aegean Sea and held him for ransom. Caesar reportedly joked with his captors that the sum they demanded was too low and insisted they raise it. Once freed, he kept his promise. He hunted them down and had every one of them crucified. It was an early glimpse of the man he would become, charming, theatrical, and utterly without mercy toward anyone who underestimated him. Caesar rose through the traditional offices of the Roman government with unusual speed, but he understood, as Sulla and Marius had understood before him, that true power in the late Republic no longer lived in the Senate chamber. It lived at the head of an army. In 60 BC, he formed an informal political alliance with two of Rome's most powerful men, the fabulously wealthy Marcus Licinius Crassus and the celebrated general Pompey the Great. Historians call this arrangement the First Triumvirate, though it held no official standing in Roman law. It was simply three ambitious men agreeing to help one another seize what the Senate would not willingly give them. With Pompey's military prestige and Crassus's money behind him, Caesar secured command of Roman forces in Gaul, the vast territory covering much of modern France and Belgium, and it was there, over the course of nearly a decade of relentless campaigning, that he transformed himself from a promising politician into the most feared general in the Roman world. The Gallic War made Caesar's reputation permanent. He conquered the whole of Gaul. At the siege of Alatia in 52 BC, he defeated a coalition of rebellious tribes through an extraordinary feat of military engineering, building a double ring of fortifications around the besieged Gallic army. One ring faced in, holding the enemy inside. The other faced out, holding off a relief force trying to break the siege. He even led 2 expeditions across the sea to Britain, a land so distant that most Romans back home could barely conceive of it. Throughout the campaign, Caesar wrote his own account of the war, commentaries on the Gallic War, sent back to Rome in installments and read aloud in the Forum. In effect, it was the ancient world's first great work of political self-promotion, a general narrating his own triumphs in plain, confident prose. The people of Rome never forgot whose legions were winning them an empire. But while Caesar's fame grew in Gaul, the fragile alliance that had made his career possible was falling apart back home. Crassus was killed in 53 BC, leading a disastrous campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east, removing one leg of the triumvirate entirely. Pompey, meanwhile, had grown increasingly wary of his former ally's soaring popularity and military strength, and the Senate, which had never fully trusted either man, began to see in Pompey a useful counterweight against Caesar's ambitions. Caesar's command in Gaul was nearing its legal end. Prompted by Pompey's allies, the Senate demanded that he disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, before seeking further political office. Caesar understood exactly what this demand meant. Without his legions behind him, he would be vulnerable to prosecution by his political enemies, stripped of the protection that had shielded Sulla and now shielded Pompey. To obey was to walk unarmed into a den of men who wanted him destroyed. In January of 49 BC, Caesar reached the banks of a small, unremarkable river called the Rubicon, which marked the legal boundary of Italy itself. Roman law was unambiguous. No general was permitted to bring an army across that boundary and into Italian territory under arms. To do so was an act of open war against the Roman state. Caesar is said to have hesitated on the riverbank, weighing the enormity of what he was about to do, before finally uttering the words that have echoed through history ever since. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. He led his 13th legion across the water, and the Republic's slow slide towards civil war became, in that single moment, an irreversible fact. The war that followed was swift and one-sided. Pompey, despite his reputation, chose to abandon Italy rather than risk a direct confrontation, retreating to the eastern Mediterranean to gather a larger army, a decision that left Rome itself undefended and allowed Caesar to enter the city almost without resistance. The two men's forces finally met at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece in 48 BC, where Caesar's smaller, more experienced legions decisively crushed Pompey's much larger army. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping for sanctuary, but the young Egyptian king's advisors wanted to win Caesar's favour. They had Pompey murdered the moment he stepped ashore and presented his severed head to Caesar as a gift. Caesar, according to several ancient sources, did not celebrate the death of his former ally and son-in-law. He wept. With his rivals dead or scattered, Caesar spent the following years mopping up the remnants of resistance across the Mediterranean world. In Egypt, he became entangled in the court politics of the young Queen Cleopatra and helped secure her hold on the throne. In North Africa and Spain, the last of Pompey's supporters made their final stands. By 45 BC, Caesar stood entirely without a rival, the unchallenged master of the Roman world. The Senate, whether from genuine fear or a desperate hope of placating him, showered him with honours that no Roman had ever received. He was named dictator, not for the traditional 6-month emergency term, but for 10 years, and then, in early 44 BC, for life. His image appeared on Roman coins, an honour previously reserved for the gods and the long-dead kings of the city's earliest legends. He sat on a golden chair in the Senate. Statues of him were placed among those of Rome's ancient kings. For many senators, and especially for the old aristocratic families who still remembered, or claimed to remember, the Republic's founding principles, this was intolerable. Caesar's genuine intentions are still debated. Perhaps he sought the title of king outright. Perhaps he simply wished to formalize the absolute power he already held. Either way, the symbolism was unmistakable to men raised on the story of Lucius Junius Brutus, who had driven out Tarquin the Proud nearly 5 centuries earlier. A conspiracy began to form, drawn not from Caesar's obvious enemies, but, more painfully, from men he had personally forgiven and elevated after the Civil War, including Marcus Junius Brutus, a senator who traced his lineage, whether accurately or not, back to the very Brutus who had ended the Age of Kings. Gaius Cassius Longinus became the conspiracy's driving force, gathering more than 60 senators into a plot that they told themselves was not murder, but liberation, the restoration of the Republic through the removal of a single man who threatened to end it. The date they chose was the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month, in the year 44 BC. Caesar had reportedly been warned. A soothsayer had told him weeks earlier to beware the Ides of March, and on the morning itself, his wife Calpurnia, shaken by nightmares, begged him not to attend the Senate session planned for that day. Caesar nearly stayed home, but a conspirator named Decimus Brutus, a man Caesar trusted deeply, arrived at his house and gently mocked him out of his hesitation, warning that the Senate would think him afraid, or worse, tyrannical, if he refused to appear before them. Caesar went. Inside the Senate house, the conspirators surrounded him under the pretense of presenting a petition. As Caesar waved the first man away, a senator named Casca struck the opening blow, a glancing cut to the neck. What followed was chaotic and merciless. More than 20 men stabbing at a single body in the confined space, several conspirators wounding one another in the frenzy. Caesar tried briefly to resist, but he saw the sheer number of men against him. Then, according to the most famous and most disputed account, he recognized Marcus Brutus among his attackers. At that, he is said to have stopped fighting entirely. He pulled his toga over his face and let the blows fall. Whether he actually spoke the words later immortalized by Shakespeare, et tu, brute. No contemporary source confirms it, but the sense of personal betrayal the story captures was very real. Caesar fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, the rival he had once wept over, and died from his wounds, struck by the ancient historian Suetonius's count 23 times. The conspirators had believed, with a kind of tragic sincerity, that killing Caesar would restore the republic they remembered, or imagined they remembered, from before the civil wars. They rushed from the Senate house waving their bloody daggers, expecting the people of Rome to celebrate their liberation. Instead, they found confusion, fear, and, before long, fury. Caesar had been enormously popular with Rome's common citizens, who had benefited from his land reforms, his public games, and his military triumphs, and his assassins found themselves forced to barricade themselves away from a grieving and increasingly hostile public. The republic they had killed to save did not spring back to life. Caesar's death did not end the age of one-man rule in Rome. It only opened a new and even more consequential struggle over who would inherit the power he had built. That struggle would ultimately be settled not by an old senator clinging to the republic's memory, but by an 18-year-old grandnephew Caesar had named, almost as an afterthought in his will, as his adopted son and heir. For nearly 200 years after the death of Augustus, the Roman Empire experienced a stretch of relative peace and stability. It was remarkable enough that later historians gave it its own name, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was not a peace without wars. Rome's legions never stopped fighting entirely along the empire's vast frontiers, but it was a peace within, a period in which the machinery of Roman government, law, and commerce could operate largely undisturbed by the civil wars and political murders that had defined the Republic's final century. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent under the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century AD, stretching from the misty hills of northern Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia, encompassing perhaps 60 million people, an enormous fraction of the entire population of the ancient world, all governed, however loosely, from a single city on the Tiber. What held such a vast and varied territory together was not, primarily, the sword. It was infrastructure. The Romans built roads with an obsessive, almost engineering-driven devotion, over 250,000 miles of them, by the empire's height, paved with layered stone, cambered to drain rainwater, and engineered to run in straight lines wherever the terrain allowed. A courier riding the imperial post system could travel from Rome to the far edges of Gaul in a matter of days, carrying orders, tax records, and news of the emperor's will faster than any comparable government had ever managed to move information before. Alongside the roads came aqueducts, extraordinary feats of engineering that carried fresh water across valleys and through hillsides, using nothing but gravity and precisely calculated gradients, feeding the public fountains, baths, and private homes of cities as far apart as Segovia in Spain and Caesarea in Judea. And, running beneath it all, was Roman law, a single coherent legal framework that, at least in principle, guaranteed certain rights and protections to Roman citizens no matter where in the empire they happened to live, from the governor's palace to the smallest provincial town. But how does an empire this vast actually convince the people it conquers to accept its rule, rather than simply endure it under threat of the legions? The Romans found their answer in a strategy that Augustus himself had refined into something close to genius: absorption rather than erasure. Consider the story of a man named Tiberius Claudius Cogidubnus, a British tribal leader who, rather than dying in resistance to Roman conquest, was permitted by the Emperor Claudius to retain a form of local kingship in exchange for loyalty to Rome. Archaeologists have found evidence of a magnificent Roman-style villa built at Fishbourne in southern England, believed by many historians to have belonged to this very client king, complete with underfloor heating, imported marble, and elaborate mosaic floors. A British chieftain living in the full material comfort of a Roman aristocrat, while his own people adjusted, gradually and often peacefully, to life under Roman administration. This was the pattern repeated across the empire. Local elites offered Roman citizenship, Roman education for their children, and a share in Roman prosperity in exchange for loyalty and taxes. It was far cheaper and far more durable than trying to hold down 60 million people by force alone. Citizenship itself became one of Rome's most effective tools of unity. In the empire's early centuries, Roman citizenship was a privilege, not a birthright, something to be earned through military service, granted as a reward to provincial elites, or purchased outright by wealthy individuals seeking its legal protections. A citizen could not be flogged without trial. A citizen could appeal a magistrate's judgment directly to the emperor himself. It was this very right that, according to the biblical Acts of the Apostles, allowed a Jewish preacher from Tarsus named Paul to avoid summary punishment in Judea and demand instead to be tried in Rome. A small but telling illustration of how deeply the idea of Roman legal protection had penetrated even the empire's furthest provinces. By the year 212 AD, the Emperor Caracalla would extend citizenship to nearly every free person within the empire's borders, a final, sweeping act that erased, at least on paper, the old distinction between conqueror and conquered that had defined Rome's relationship with its territories for centuries. This era of stability produced a flowering of culture and daily life that Romans themselves regarded as the natural reward of their peace. In the great cities, life revolved around the public bath complex, vast structures that were far more than places to wash. A Roman citizen of even modest means might spend hours at the baths, moving between the frigidarium's cold plunge, the tepidarium's warm air, and the searing heat of the caldarium, before relaxing in gardens, libraries, or exercise yards attached to the complex, surrounded by rich and poor alike, in one of the few genuinely shared public spaces the ancient world produced. The Colosseum in Rome, begun under the Emperor Vespasian and completed by his son Titus in 80 AD, could hold an estimated 50,000 spectators for gladiatorial games and staged animal hunts, entertainments that were brutal by any modern measure, but which Romans understood as a display of the empire's power over life, death, and even the wild beasts of its furthest conquered territories: elephants from Africa, lions from Mesopotamia, bears from the forests of Germany, all brought to die in the heart of the capital as living trophies of Roman reach. Trade flowed across this unified world with an ease unmatched again in Europe for well over 1,000 years afterward. Grain from Egypt fed the city of Rome itself, shipped across the Mediterranean each year in vast fleets. One Roman baker, a freedman named Marcus Vigilius Eurysaces, built an entire fortune supplying the capital with bread from that imported grain. When he died, he had himself buried in a tomb shaped like a giant oven, its stone frieze carved with scenes of his own bakery at work. It still stands in Rome today, near the Porta Maggiore. Wine from Gaul and olive oil from Spain travelled the same sea routes, Luxury goods followed too: silk from China, spices from India, incense from Arabia, carried along trade networks that stretched, indirectly, far beyond the empire's own borders. A single Roman currency, minted with the emperor's face on every coin from Britain to Syria, meant a merchant like Eurysaces could do business across the entire Mediterranean world without the friction of exchanging currency between dozens of kingdoms, a level of economic integration Europe would not see again until the modern era. Yet even at its height, Roman peace was never a peace of equals. It was a peace built upon a vast and largely invisible foundation of enslaved labour, working the fields of Sicily and North Africa, mining silver in Spain, and staffing the households of wealthy citizens throughout the empire. And it depended, at every moment, on the continued loyalty of the legions stationed along thousands of miles of frontier. Professional soldiers who had sworn their oath not to the abstract idea of Rome, but to the emperor himself, a dependency that Augustus's careful constitutional arrangements had never fully resolved. For nearly 2 centuries, a remarkable run of capable, often thoughtful emperors, men like Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, managed this arrangement with sufficient skill to keep the empire's internal peace largely intact. Marcus Aurelius himself, ruling in the 2nd century AD, spent long nights on campaign along the Danube frontier, writing private philosophical reflections, later gathered as his meditations on duty, mortality, and the burden of holding together a world as vast as the one he had inherited. He worried in those private pages about a great many things. What he could not have fully foreseen was how quickly and how completely the careful machinery built by Augustus and refined by his successors would begin, within only a few decades of his own death, to come apart at the seams. The young man's name was Gaius Octavius. News reached him that Caesar had been murdered, and that Caesar's will had named him adopted son and heir to his fortune. He was barely 18 years old. He was studying abroad in Greece, with no army, no political office, and no obvious claim to the chaos now unfolding in Rome. Nearly everyone who heard the news, including his own family, urged him to decline the inheritance and live quietly, reasoning that a teenager could not possibly survive what was coming. Octavian, as he would come to be known, ignored them entirely. He sailed for Italy, adopted Caesar's name as his own, becoming Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and began, with a coolness that startled men 3 times his age, to build the alliances and raise the soldiers he would need to claim what he now considered rightfully his. Rome, in the meantime, had fractured into competing factions. Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant and a seasoned military commander, had assumed leadership in the immediate aftermath of the assassination and had little patience for a teenage rival, however famous his adopted name. Cicero, the Republic's most celebrated orator, saw in young Octavian a useful tool to check Antony's ambitions and delivered a series of blistering public speeches against Antony, never suspecting that the boy he hoped to use would soon outmaneuver them both. For a time, Octavian and Antony fought as enemies, their armies clashing in northern Italy. But both men understood, as Caesar and Pompey once had, that a divided field left room for others to seize power in the confusion. In 43 BC, Octavian, Antony, and a third general named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus formed a new alliance, the Second Triumvirate. This one granted formal legal authority by the Senate itself. Unlike Caesar's earlier informal arrangement, their first act together was chilling in its efficiency. They drew up new proscription lists, condemning their political enemies to death and seizing their property, much as Sulla had done a generation before. Cicero had spent his final months warning Rome of the dangers of one-man rule. He was hunted down and killed on Antony's orders. His hands, and the tongue that had delivered his famous speeches, were nailed up for public display in the Forum. With their enemies eliminated, the triumvirs turned to hunt down Caesar's actual assassins, Brutus and Cassius, who had fled east and raised an army of their own. The two sides met at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, where the forces of Octavian and Antony crushed the conspirators decisively. Both Brutus and Cassius, seeing their cause defeated, took their own lives on the battlefield rather than face capture, the last defenders of a republic that had, in truth, already ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. But eliminating a common enemy did not resolve the deeper tension between the two men who remained. Lepidus was gradually pushed aside, stripped of real power, and left to live out his life in quiet obscurity, and the Roman world was effectively divided between its two remaining strongmen. Antony took the wealthy eastern provinces, where he fell deeply, famously into a political and romantic alliance with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. Octavian remained in the west, patiently consolidating his control over Italy and its legions. With remarkable political skill for a man still in his 20s, he cultivated a public image of himself as the guardian of traditional Roman values. Antony, by contrast, was cast in Octavian's carefully managed propaganda as a man who had gone native, abandoning Roman virtue for the luxury and foreign customs of an Egyptian court. The final rupture came in 32 BC. Octavian, in a move of considerable audacity, obtained what he claimed was Antony's will, reportedly seized from the Vestal virgins who held it in trust, and read it aloud to the Senate. The document, whether genuine or selectively presented, revealed that Antony intended to be buried in Egypt beside Cleopatra rather than in Rome, and appeared to grant Roman territories to Cleopatra's children. To a Roman public already suspicious of Antony's entanglement with a foreign queen, this was proof enough of betrayal. War was declared, not against Antony directly, but against Cleopatra, a foreign enemy of the state. A war against a fellow Roman still carried the stain of civil conflict. A war against a foreign queen did not. The framing was a masterstroke. It let Octavian present himself not as one more general in an endless Roman civil war, but as the defender of Rome itself against a foreign threat. The decisive battle came at Actium, off the coast of Greece, in September of 31 BC, fought primarily at sea between Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, and the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The battle turned decisively against the couple, and when Cleopatra's ships withdrew from the fighting, Antony abandoned his own fleet to follow her, a choice his own soldiers would never forgive. Both fled to Egypt. The following year, Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria. Rather than be paraded through Rome as captives, both took their own lives. Antony fell on his sword after receiving false news of Cleopatra's death. Cleopatra, according to the most enduring account, let an asp bite her rather than surrender her dignity to Octavian's triumph. Octavian stood, at last, as the sole master of the entire Roman world, without a single rival left alive who could challenge him. He was 32 years old. And here, in this moment of absolute victory, he made the decision that would separate him from every ambitious man who had come before him, from Sulla, from Caesar, from all the generals who had marched their legions on Rome, only to grasp for titles the Roman people still associated with tyranny. Octavian did not declare himself king. He did not even keep the title of dictator that Caesar had held. Instead, in 27 BC, he appeared before the Senate, and, in a piece of political theatre as carefully staged as anything Rome had ever seen, formally offered to give up his extraordinary powers and restore the Republic entirely. The Senate, whether out of genuine gratitude, calculated flattery, or simple fear of what might follow if they took him at his word, refused. They begged him to remain. And in response, Octavian graciously accepted a series of powers and honours that, taken individually, seemed modest and traditionally Roman, but which, taken together, amounted to complete control of the state. He was granted the title Augustus, meaning the revered one, a word carrying religious rather than political connotations, deliberately avoiding any echo of king. He held the powers of a tribune without ever holding the office itself. This made his person sacred. It also gave him the ability to veto any action by any other magistrate. He controlled the provinces where the bulk of Rome's legions were stationed. This ensured the loyalty of the army rested with him personally. The Senate, meanwhile, retained nominal authority over Rome's older, more peaceful territories. Every institution of the Old Republic, the Senate, the consuls, the popular assemblies, continued to exist, to meet, and to hold elections. But real power over war, peace, law, and succession now rested with a single man. He dressed in the modest robes of an ordinary senator. He insisted, until the end of his life, that he was merely the first citizen among equals, princeps. That title would give its name to the entire era that followed, the Principate. Historians would later call it one of the most successful acts of political disguise in human history. Caesar, for all his brilliance, never fully grasped what Augustus understood. The Roman aristocracy could tolerate almost any concentration of power, so long as its outward forms and symbols were left intact. He restored temples, revived old religious rituals, passed laws encouraging traditional Roman marriage and family life, and commissioned poets like Virgil and Horace to celebrate a new golden age of peace and Roman virtue, all while quietly ensuring that no institution in Rome could any longer challenge his will. He reformed the army into a permanent, professional force loyal to the state, and by extension to him, rather than to whichever general happened to be paying its soldiers. He created a new elite guard, the Praetorian Guard, stationed in Rome itself, ostensibly to protect the state, in practice to protect its ruler. He reorganized the empire's finances, its provincial governance, and its grain supply with a bureaucratic thoroughness that would keep Rome fed and functioning for centuries. Augustus finally died in the year 14 AD, after a reign of over 4 decades. At his deathbed, he is said to have asked those gathered around him a final, telling question. Had he played his part well in the comedy of life? It was a striking way for a man to describe his own rule. Even at the very end, he seemed to acknowledge that the entire Principate had been, in some sense, a performance. It was a careful, deliberate illusion, one that let him hold the absolute power of a king while never once claiming the title. The republic that Brutus and his fellow conspirators had killed Caesar to preserve was, by the time Augustus died, little more than a memory dressed up in ceremonial robes. In its place stood something new, an empire, vast, orderly, and utterly dependent on the will of a single family. What that empire would achieve at the height of its power, and how far its roads, its laws, and its legions would eventually stretch, is where we turn next. Marcus Aurelius died in the year 180 AD, and with his death, the long run of capable emperors that had sustained the Pax Romana came to an abrupt and consequential end. His son and successor, Commodus, showed little of his father's philosophical restraint. He preferred fighting as a gladiator in the arena, an activity considered deeply shameful for a Roman emperor, to the tedious work of governing an empire. He was eventually strangled in his bath by a wrestler hired by his own inner circle. The murder plunged Rome into a brief but violent civil war over the succession. The 3rd century AD would bring Rome closer to total collapse than it had come at any point since the darkest days of Hannibal's invasion, a period so chaotic that historians simply call it the crisis of the 3rd century. Between the years 235 and 284 AD, the Roman Empire cycled through more than 20 different emperors, the vast majority of whom died by assassination, execution, or in battle against rival claimants to the throne. The problem Augustus had always managed to obscure, that the legions, not the Senate, were the true source of imperial power, now revealed itself with brutal clarity. Provincial armies, isolated for months at a time, along distant frontiers, and increasingly resentful of a central government that seemed unable to protect them or pay them reliably, simply began declaring their own commanders emperor, regardless of what Rome itself might think of the matter. A general might be raised to the purple by his troops in Syria one year, marched on Italy to fight the reigning emperor, win or lose, and be murdered by his own soldiers within months when a better-paying rival appeared. The empire briefly fractured into three competing states: a breakaway Gallic empire in the west, a Palmyrene empire in the east, and the central Roman state itself. The two breakaway empires had their own emperors, their own coinage, their own governments. Rome, which had once claimed the whole Mediterranean world, now struggled simply to hold Italy together. Compounding the political chaos was a wave of external pressure that the empire's frontiers had never faced in quite this combination before. Along the Rhine and Danube, Germanic peoples, the Goths, the Alemanni, the Franks, pressed against Roman defences with growing frequency and force, sometimes raiding deep into Roman territory before being pushed back. In the east, a newly aggressive Persian dynasty, the Sassanids, inflicted a catastrophe on Rome that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. In 260 AD, the Roman Emperor Valerian was captured alive in battle by the Persian king Shapur I, and only time in the empire's history that a reigning emperor fell into enemy hands. According to Persian accounts, and later Roman ones coloured by the shame of it, Valerian was kept as a living trophy. As the story is told, he was used as a human footstool whenever the Persian king mounted his horse. After his death, his skin was said to have been stuffed with straw and displayed as a permanent reminder of Roman humiliation. Economic strain deepened the wound. To pay for the endless cycle of civil wars and frontier defence, successive emperors debased Rome's silver coinage again and again, reducing the actual precious metal content of each coin while keeping its face value the same, a short-term fix that produced long-term ruin. By the height of the crisis, a Roman silver coin might contain only a thin wash of silver over a core of cheap bronze. Inflation followed. Predictably, merchants and soldiers alike lost faith in a currency that was worth less with every passing year. Trade routes that had once carried grain, wine and oil across a peaceful Mediterranean grew increasingly unsafe, disrupted by both foreign raiders and the marching armies of rival Roman claimants. Cities that had stood unwalled for centuries, confident in the protection of the legions, began hastily constructing defensive walls for the first time in generations, a quiet but unmistakable admission that the old peace could no longer be taken for granted. Remarkably, the empire did not fall apart entirely. A series of tough, capable soldier emperors clawed the state back from the brink through sheer military competence. One of them, Aurelian, earned the title Restorer of the World for reuniting the breakaway Gallic and Palmyrene territories back into a single empire. Even these men often fell to the same assassinations that had claimed so many of their predecessors. But the empire that emerged from the crisis in the late 3rd century was not the same confident, unified state that Marcus Aurelius had once ruled. It had been fundamentally changed, and the man who would formalize that change was an emperor named Diocletian, who came to power in 284 AD, determined never to let the chaos of the previous 50 years repeat itself. Diocletian's solution was radical. He reasoned that no single man could govern or defend a territory as vast as Rome's from one capital, so he split the position of emperor itself. The new system was called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4, 2 senior emperors, each called an Augustus, and 2 junior emperors, each called a Caesar, divided responsibility for the empire's eastern and western halves between them. The Tetrarchy was an attempt to solve the empire's succession crisis through careful institutional design, much as Augustus had once tried. But it also quietly acknowledged something that would prove impossible to fully reverse. The empire had grown too large, too strained, and too dangerous for one man and one capital to hold together alone. Diocletian also expanded the imperial bureaucracy dramatically, reorganized the army, and imposed sweeping economic controls, including a famous but largely unsuccessful edict fixing maximum prices on goods across the empire in a desperate attempt to halt runaway inflation. The East-West division Diocletian formalized would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in Rome's entire history. It deepened further under the Emperor Constantine. Constantine reunified the empire under his own sole rule in 324 AD, after defeating his last remaining rival. Then he made a choice that would permanently reshape the balance of power within it. Rather than ruling from Rome itself, Constantine founded a magnificent new capital on the site of an old Greek city called Byzantium, at the strategic crossing point between Europe and Asia. He named it, with characteristic modesty, after himself, Constantinople. The new city was wealthier, better defended, and more centrally positioned to manage the empire's eastern frontiers than Rome had ever been, and its rise marked, whether anyone fully recognized it at the time, the slow beginning of the old capital's long eclipse. Constantine's reign brought other transformations too. In 313 AD, through the Edict of Milan, issued jointly with his co-emperor Licinius, he granted legal tolerance to Christianity, a faith that had been periodically persecuted by earlier emperors. He himself converted before his death, setting the empire on a path that would see the old Roman gods gradually give way to a new Christian order over the following century. By the time Constantine died in 337 AD, the Roman Empire had survived its great 3rd century crisis. But it had survived as something structurally different from what it had once been. It was split increasingly between a wealthy, well-defended east centered on Constantinople and a western half that remained poorer and more exposed, its frontier pressed by Germanic peoples with ever-growing insistence. For a time, this arrangement held, but the pressure building beyond Rome's borders had not disappeared. It had only been temporarily managed. Within a few short decades, an event thousands of miles away, on the steppes of Central Asia, would set in motion a chain of migrations and invasions. The western half of the empire, weakened by a century of crisis and division, would ultimately prove unable to survive it. The chain of events that would end the Western Roman Empire began, improbably, with a people the Romans knew almost nothing about. In the closing decades of the 4th century, a nomadic warrior people from the steppes of Central Asia, the Huns, began pushing westward with devastating military force, displacing the peoples in their path. Among those displaced were the Goths, a Germanic people who had lived for generations along the Danube frontier, sometimes at war with Rome, sometimes in uneasy alliance with it. In 376 AD, a vast number of Gothic refugees fled the Huns and arrived at the Danube, men, women, and children, numbering perhaps in the tens of thousands. They begged the Roman Empire for permission to cross the river and settle within its borders. In exchange, they offered their loyalty and their soldiers. The Roman Emperor Valens agreed to let them in, but what followed was a catastrophic failure of Roman administration. Corrupt local officials, tasked with feeding the desperate refugees, instead exploited them, according to Roman accounts, selling starving Gothic families dog meat in exchange for their children, who were then taken as slaves. The Goths, betrayed by the very empire they had hoped would protect them, rose in furious rebellion. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, a Gothic army inflicted one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman military history, killing the Emperor Valens himself along with as much as 2/3 of his eastern field army. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing not long after, compared the scale of the disaster to the ancient catastrophe at Cannae centuries before. Rome would recover from Adrianople in the short term, but the battle had proven something that would echo across the following century. A barbarian people, properly organized and sufficiently desperate, could now defeat a Roman army in open battle. The old assumption of unquestioned Roman military superiority had been broken, and it would never be fully restored. Over the following decades, the western half of the empire found itself absorbing wave after wave of pressure it was increasingly ill-equipped to manage. The Western government, based first at Milan and later at the well-defended marsh city of Ravenna, grew steadily poorer. It also grew steadily more dependent on the very Germanic peoples it was struggling to hold at bay, hiring Gothic and other barbarian soldiers to fill its ranks. Roman citizens themselves seemed less and less willing or able to join. For years, the Visigothic king Alaric had negotiated with a Roman government that repeatedly promised him land and payment and repeatedly failed to deliver. In 410 AD, he ran out of patience. He marched his army into Italy, and for the first time in almost 800 years, breached the walls of the city of Rome itself. The sack that followed lasted 3 days. By the standards of ancient warfare, it was relatively restrained. Alaric was himself a Christian, and he ordered his soldiers to spare churches and those who sought sanctuary within them. But the psychological shock across the Roman world was immense. Saint Jerome, the Christian scholar living in far-off Bethlehem, wrote upon hearing the news that his voice choked with sobs as he dictated the words, "The city which had taken the whole world captive was itself now captive." The following decades brought little relief. Vandal peoples crossed from Spain into North Africa, seizing the rich grain-producing provinces that had helped feed Rome and the Western Empire for centuries, cutting off a vital economic lifeline. In 451 AD, the Huns themselves, now united under their fearsome king Attila, invaded Gaul, only to be turned back at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains by a combined Roman and Gothic army, one of the last occasions on which the Western Empire could still muster a genuinely effective military response to an external threat. But the reprieve was brief. By 455 AD, the Vandals had built a formidable fleet in their new North African territory. They crossed the Mediterranean and sacked Rome a second time, far more thoroughly than Alaric's forces had 4 decades earlier. The destruction was so total that the Vandals' very name would eventually enter the English language as a synonym for senseless ruin. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had become, in practice, a shadow of its former self. Its territory shrank with each passing decade. Its treasury was exhausted. The emperors in Ravenna came and went with dizzying, almost forgettable frequency. Real power now belonged to Germanic generals serving nominally within the Roman military structure, men who found it more convenient to rule through a puppet emperor than to claim the increasingly hollow title for themselves. One such general would finally bring the Western Empire's long unraveling to its quiet, almost anticlimactic conclusion. His name was Odoacer, a soldier of mixed Germanic heritage, commanding a force of Germanic troops serving in the Roman army. In 475 AD, a Roman general named Orestes had installed his own young son as emperor, a boy who bore, with an irony history would later find almost too perfect, the name Romulus Augustus, echoing both the legendary founder of the city and its first true emperor in a single small child's name. The boy was barely into his teens, entirely powerless, a figurehead controlled completely by his ambitious father. His reign lasted less than a year. Odoacer's troops, denied the land grants in Italy they had been promised for their service, rose in revolt, killed Orestes, and marched on Ravenna. Facing no meaningful resistance, Odoacer deposed the boy emperor in September of 476 AD. What is most remarkable about the moment that, more than any other, historians have chosen to mark as the end of the Western Roman Empire is how little violence attended it. Odoacer did not kill young Romulus Augustus. He He simply removed him from power, granted him a pension, and sent him to live out his life quietly in a villa in southern Italy. His ultimate fate afterward lost entirely to history. Odoacer then sent the imperial regalia, the symbols of Roman authority in the west, east to Constantinople, with a message to the emperor there that the Western Empire no longer required an emperor of its own, that one ruler, based in the east, was sufficient to embody Rome's authority. He would rule Italy himself, not as emperor, but as a king, under the nominal, distant authority of Constantinople. There was no final battle, no dramatic last stand, no burning of the city to mark the moment an empire that had stood, in one form or another, for well over 1,000 years since the legendary days of Romulus and his she-wolf, finally ceased to exist in the West. It ended, instead, with the quiet deposition of a powerless teenager whose name happened to carry the whole weight of Rome's beginning and end within it. Some ancient writers could hardly resist commenting on the coincidence. The Western Roman Empire simply stopped, not with a roar, but with an administrative formality, a set of royal robes shipped east, and a boy sent to live quietly in a villa by the sea. And yet Rome, in every sense but the political one, did not vanish. In the east, the empire endured for another 1,000 years as what historians now call the Byzantine Empire. Its emperors in Constantinople continuing to call themselves Roman, its laws, codified under the 6th century Emperor Justinian, preserving and transmitting the accumulated legal wisdom of centuries of Roman jurisprudence to the medieval and modern worlds that followed. In the West, the Latin language Rome had carried to every corner of its empire slowly transformed, over the centuries, into Italian, French, and Spanish, along with several other languages still spoken across Europe today, tongues carried by hundreds of millions of people who speak fragments of Roman speech in every sentence, without ever thinking of it. The Christian Church, which had grown up within the empire's borders, and under its protection since Constantine's conversion, adopted much of Rome's own administrative structure, its bishops often governing territories that mapped almost exactly onto the old boundaries of Roman provinces, ensuring that a form of Roman organization would outlast the empire that created it by well over a millennium. Roman roads, in places, still carry traffic today. Roman aqueducts, in places, still stand. Roman law still shapes the legal systems of dozens of modern nations, and the Latin alphabet in which this very sentence would once have been written in Rome's own tongue remains, in its essential form, the alphabet of much of the world. To walk through Rome today is to walk through every layer of this long, extraordinary story at once. The Colosseum still stands, worn and broken, where 50,000 Romans once watched the empire's power performed as spectacle. The Roman Forum, where Brutus once held Lucretia's body aloft and swore his oath against kings, where Cicero once thundered his speeches against Antony, where Caesar's body was burned by a grieving crowd, lies now in quiet ruin, its fallen columns a kind of open-air monument to everything that rose and fell upon this ground. And somewhere beneath the modern city, archaeologists continue to find traces of that first humble settlement on the Palatine Hill, the huts of shepherds who could never have imagined that their small refuge beside a muddy river would one day give its name, its law, and its language to half the known world. The story of Rome, in the end, offers no simple lesson, no single cause for either its extraordinary rise or its long, uneven fall. It rose through a combination of ruthless ambition and genuine ingenuity, through violence, and through the very unusual willingness to absorb former enemies as future citizens. And it did not fall in a single catastrophic moment, but through centuries of slow strain, civil war, economic decay, and mounting pressure from beyond its borders, until the weight of it all finally became more than the western half of the empire could bear. Perhaps this is the oldest and most enduring lesson history has to offer. No power, however vast, however permanent it may feel to the people living within it, is ever entirely safe from the same slow erosion that touches everything built by human hands. Tea ended, instead, with the Kwai, the she-wolf who once fed two abandoned twins beside the Tiber, could not have known what she was truly nurturing. An empire that would one day stretch from the highlands of Scotland to the deserts of Syria. An empire that would, after 1,000 years of glory and struggle, quietly hand its last emperor's crown to a Germanic king and fade at last into the deep and patient soil of history. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through the story of Rome tonight. I hope it has carried you, as it carried me, through the full arc of a civilization's life, from its first uncertain beginnings to its long and gentle close. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.